Hey, welcome to Biofounders. My name is Sofia Sanchez, and in this podcast, we have fun conversations with unconventional founders, biohackers, CEOs, and investors you haven't met yet. You can follow along on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Biopunk Labs or at Sofia S. Bio. That is me. YouTube, links in the description. And support this podcast, please, by sharing it with your friends and give it a 5-star rating. This episode is a conversation with Alexander Titus, a commissioner at the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology in the US. He previously worked at the DoD as the head of biotechnology strategy and helped launch public-private partnerships Biomade and Army. With too many interests to count, Titus was also part of early-stage startups like Colossal Biosciences, yes, the guys who brought back the dire wolf and woolly mice. He's worked at Google's Healthcare and Life Sciences division and co-founded Dauntless Ventures and Decycle Bio. We followed each other since he ran BioXYZ in 2020, and he now writes at the intersection of science, technology, policy, futures, and fiction through the Connected Ideas Project. His first science fiction novel, Synthetic Eden, is also now available. So in this episode, we start by touching on what kinds of conversations were being had around biotechnology during the pandemic in the Pentagon. Were people asking questions at all? Was biotech interesting? What kinds of misunderstandings happen between the public and the private sector, and what we can do to bridge these two a little bit better? Then also, how can scientists go from only fact-telling to storytelling? And the importance of science fiction, in fact, in discussing issues that could be seen as controversial, such as designer babies, genetically engineered human embryos. Because we both agree, Titus and I, that these subjects are no longer if questions, but when questions. And they are definitely going to redefine what it means to be human. He shares a little bit about the questions that he was asking himself when he was at Colossal Biosciences, thinking, where does an elephant end and a woolly mammoth begin, or vice versa? And I was particularly curious to know, what will happen when we, in fact, adopt these technologies to such an extent that we develop a dependency on them? So how will humans change and the meaning of being a human when artificial intelligence and robotics actually are so embedded in that process of growing things? Finally, given all the changes that have been going on in the biotech industry, especially this year, especially in countries like the US and China, how can we better assess progress in our industry? Are metrics like papers and patents published enough, or should we be looking at something else? Of course, since Titus has been all over the place, between academia, industry, and the government, what does he make of all of this? How does he make all of these connections? How does one choose what to work on at a given time? I personally found the conversation with Titus very insightful. I actually wrote down some takeaways and notes that you can check out in the link in the description. Lastly, check out biopunk.life for weekly updates on the biotech ecosystem. Tell your friends about Biofounders to keep it alive, and let's go to the episode. Ready now. Okay, well, thank you.
Cool.
Thank you for coming to the Biofounders podcast. Do you prefer Titus, right?
Yep, Titus.
Okay, awesome. Well, then, obviously, you've moved around the Congress, Silicon Valley, deep tech startups. What do you think each of these areas or communities misunderstands from each other when it comes to biotechnology? Is there anything that gets lost in translation?
Yes, quite a bit. Well, first, I appreciate you inviting me to the podcast. It's super cool because I've been following your Substack for a while. So shout out to Biopunk for anyone you probably know us since you're listening to this, but if you don't, that's pretty cool. So I think that so I spent a lot of my time thinking about where these technologies that are emerging impact in ways that non-experts might not be thinking about. And for a bit of context for everyone listening, my career has spanned a bit in government, a bit in academia, and a bit in industry. Startups, big companies, big government, things like that. And each, this is true of any community, like each community has their own language. They talk about things in a very specific way. But I think that one of the most common misconceptions is not actually about the technology, but it's about the process with which how that community operates. So innovators love to say government is super slow. And compared to a startup, government is really slow, but it's by design. When you have to move you know, an organization with hundreds of thousands of dollars and billions of dollars in funding, things don't swing quickly, but when they do, they make big moves. So it's very much the kind of lumbering elephant that can actually move mountains. But of course, it's slower than the average startup wants to work on. And then the opposite is true, where government often thinks industry is fast and loose, or it's easy to just do something, go do it. Here's a couple dollars. But it's never, especially in the biotech world, it's never as easy as that. One of the things that I heard recently from some colleagues is that oftentimes the government can't, whatever government is, right, can try to think they're being helpful, but often just kind of get in the way with rules. And so there's this disconnect of the way organizations operate. And that's actually where I spent a lot of my time, is helping organizations understand how the other side, quote unquote, functions. And then all of these people collectively look at academia as the most innovative kind of next frontier. And then universities are slow and bureaucratic. And so there's just, that understanding of the other way of working is actually one of the most important ways that I help I spend a lot of my time helping people figure out.
Yeah, and I was going to ask actually if you think this um, sort of misunderstandings or disconnections can be in some way like bridged by people like yourself who have all of these perspectives, or maybe by having better communication on any of these sides. Like what do you think is missing so that each part understands each other better?
I really think it's that shared experience. There's an age old English adage that you don't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes, and that really is true. And there's some really great, at least in the U.S., there's some really great ways to do this. And so for the bringing science expertise into government, there are interesting fellowships. So like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, has a policy fellowship where they help people coming out of their recent PhD and postdoc grads, or people who have kind of established scientists, come into government and provide that science perspective into policy. What I do think we lack is the other way. I think that there is oftentimes, especially in the US, but I'm sure this is government service, civil servants everywhere, right? That is a whole career in itself. And there's rarely opportunities to go do an internship or a fellowship in these innovative startups. So I think that we need more of those kinds of um, overlaps. And then there's also a whole new category of kind of institution. It's not a new category, but another category of institution that are these public-private partnerships. So can government and industry build something together? In the U.S., there's a good example of the biomanufacturing institutes. So BioMade, and Army and Nimble are three of them in the U.S. And that's a partnership between either the Department of Defense or the Department of Commerce and in the private sector. So a nonprofit plus a whole bunch of industry orgs. And so I think that if anyone could spend any amount of time on the other side, no matter which direction you're going, you really grow a deep appreciation for how the other world works, because it's very rarely are people being stubborn. Usually it's just a misalignment of order of operations.
When you were leading biotech strategy at the DoD, it was around or before COVID started.
It
What were
was.
some of the questions being asked then about biotech?
um, I laugh because there were two types. There
Hmm.
were no questions in a lot of circles because it's like I don't even know what to ask. And then the other types of questions were, why do you think you're useful? Basically, the disbelief kind of questions.
Hmm.
Um, and I would say that so for a bit of kind of context there, my role was in the Pentagon, which is kind of the big corporate part of the DoD. And so my job was to help bring and build a team to start the first kind of enterprise strategy for the DoD, where our all of our service branches, so the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all have amazing scientists in their lab system. So we have the Army Research Lab, the Navy Research Lab, Air Force Research Lab. They have been doing amazing biotech work for decades, but it was the kind of big corporate body of the DoD that didn't quite understand the value of that for the long term. And so I always like to describe it as my job was to bring the green goo to the Zoom and Boom people, because that way, people understood. They start to understand. So I actually started using props, like products that from companies from around the country and around the world, to show that real products can be made with biotech. And once people started having these aha moments, then the questions started to be much more mature in that. Okay, so if you could build a brick, can you build a building? Or how fast do you think you could produce this new chemical that we can't buy anymore? Or if we can do this in Virginia, can we do this somewhere on a base somewhere around the world where we really need to produce some new material? And so the questions started to pick up. But I lovingly joke that when I started, most people could barely spell DNA, let alone understand why it is useful. And of course, I'm really giving my colleagues a hard time because there's a lot of brilliant people, but it's just a technology that's so new that still to this day, most people don't quite appreciate it. But I was there in 2019, leading into the pandemic in 2020. And the pandemic really opened a lot of people's eyes as
Yeah.
well. All of a sudden, we had whole military vessels, aircraft carriers, who were temporarily unable to operate because of COVID, and all of a sudden, biology became real from a defense standpoint, and not in a traditional biodefense, but in an actual like, oh my gosh, we can't actually operate our military vessels for 2 weeks because everyone's in quarantine, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It seemed evident that the pandemic brought biology to the mainstream in perhaps negative and positive ways. With vaccines
Always.
potentially, but also when you mentioned that you started to actually show people some of these biotech maybe prototypes or products. Do you think that is it apart from again the different communication that we can do in biotech? Is it also showing more than telling that can help, let's say, strengthen the credibility of these biotech founders or even academics? Because it seems like maybe biology has been too closed door and too like jargon and closed and siloed in conferences and papers that nobody else reads. And I'm wondering then, what is needed to build more credibility of the people doing the work and the fact that the work exists in the first place. And then that's, one step. And the other question obviously is, as you said, how fast can it scale? How much can it scale? How cheap can it be? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's so there. People often say show don't tell, but I think that there is also a different way to tell, and it's
Okay.
actually one of the reasons why I started writing my newsletter. I recently published my first science fiction novel because there are other ways to tell that work from the proverbial heart rather than the mind. Most biotechnologists are scientists. And
Yeah.
so we are trained. I'm a scientist. I was trained to operate and talk and write in a very specific way that is very fact driven. And honestly boring. Scientific papers are not exactly riveting, um, especially but if you know what it means, then okay, you can get excited about it. But it's no one loves to fall asleep reading papers. I won't say no one. Some people do, but it's not like you get sucked into your sci-fi or your fantasy novel or your nonfiction book, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Um, and so I think there's a combination of that. There's the not just the facts telling, but there is the storytelling, and then there is the showing for sure. And I think that one of the contexts that I often try to help people understand is that unlike a lot of other fields, biology is kind of a faith-based science. You can't see it, and I don't mean in the religious sense. I mean it
Mhm.
like you have to like trust that what people are saying is true because you can't see it. Even when we have medicines, right? It's usually a clear vial of liquid, a
Yeah.
clear vial of clear liquid. And so you're like, all right, versus like physics, we can see an airplane fly. So we at least understand something about physics. Um, Now, if you go out and talk to people about quantum physics, you're going to get the same amount of confusion because that's hard to see, but you can see physics. You can see electrical engineering. You know your phone works. Even chemicals, right? You put gas in your vehicle every day. That is a chemical that people understand. But biology, we eat food, we are biology, and we take medicine. That's kind of most people's experience with it. So using it as a tool or a product or a way of manufacturing is a pretty foreign concept if you're not familiar with biology. And that's why I think the story matters almost as much. The most important thing is actually delivering what you say you can do and showing the potential. But I think the story matters a lot in that as well. And there are some storytellers, like Biopunk's a cool example of like telling those stories out there. But there is just not enough mainstream stories, right? There's a whole bunch of Hollywood movies about AI and nuclear stuff and all that kind of thing. And there are some scary disease related movies, but there's not a lot of, right? No one has that action scene where James Bond runs out and quickly manufactures something in the back of
Mhm.
his Aston Martin so that he could use it to hack into break a lock or something, right? We haven't had to
Yeah.
see that story yet. And so I think story is as much and important as doing the doing, but you have to do something to then tell the story, right? If we only ever tell a story, then we are just storytellers.
Right. And I think in a sense, maybe these biotech storytellers may not come from, the biotech world, but may come from other places as biology, biotech, let's say consumer products start actually penetrating the mainstream. I've seen some recent good stories about like, I don't know, high performance athletes using peptides, right? And it's like, whoa,
Yeah,
like when it actually comes to, I don't know, health, longevity, or athletic performance, people start to care, even beauty products, right?
right.
Ozempic, it might be the one of the greatest examples these days of that. So anyway, in that sense, I also wanted to ask you, would you say that is like the principle that you follow when you're writing about biology, about biotech? Why did you start BioXYZ? Why did you start the Connected Ideas project? Yeah, what have been the lessons there as well?
So when I was doing my job at the Pentagon, I learned that there was this disconnect between the amazing scientists in the labs and the people who don't understand biology but understand kind of the outcomes of what defense is focused on. And that's really where I started. So I've started during the pandemic with Bioeconomy.XYZ as a way to build the platform for other people to tell their stories. And then about a year ago, I started the Connected Ideas project, and I named it that specifically because I wanted to start connecting ideas from different disciplines, whether it's from our lives, from the government policy world, or from the science world. But I think that the big disconnect is a lot of people speak to the what and not so much to the why, and that the art of the why. Oftentimes in science, we think, oh, I don't want to sell. I don't want to sell myself. The science should speak for itself. But that's not actually true. I think that you don't have to sell any salesperson sense to be able to just talk about the impact. And that's actually I mentioned that's why I started getting into fiction as well, because when you have fiction, you can actually build characters that live the experience that you're trying to talk about, right? I've written hundreds of white papers. I could write another white paper or scientific paper, and it becomes a PDF that someone puts in their citation manager to read later. But when you have real story, you can have someone who spends 500 pages with one character to think about how you can the emotional journey of that. And so you can do that on um, small scales, small time scales as well. My Substack, often I write a sci-fi Friday short that's inspired by some current event because, okay, cool. This was announced. What does that mean? All right, let's explore in 2,000 words kind of a character who has lived the impact of that decision. And to me, I find that really fascinating way to almost forecast and plan, kind of scenario plan how these technologies are evolving.
One of your articles this year explores this idea that germline or embryo editing is coming to the mainstream again, or like people are starting to talk about it again.
Yeah.
One, because it's like we are starting to see it as an actual technological possibility, perhaps because the thoughts around it. People, let's say in Silicon Valley, are starting to consider it. People who can actually fund these companies or who would be willing to perhaps have designer babies themselves. And I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion on that, but actually, how do you think? What are sort of the pillars or core ideas that you would consider in order to debate about this topic? Because I feel like often we get lost in, first of all, the definitions of certain concepts, right? It's hard sometimes for people to segment things. And second, then I think it's also different to think about it from a moral standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a technological one. So how do you think about questions that could be as controversial as whether we should genetically modify embryos?
I think that's the crux of a lot of what I try to do is help people grapple with these questions, and that's why I write the way I do. I'll give you a not embryo anecdote, but from the kind of anti-GMO movement,
Mm-hmm.
right? Genetically modified organisms. There's still a little bit of debate about what that actually means. Because Chihuahua is not exactly a naturally occurring organism, right? We have selectively bred Chihuahuas, Pugs, Great Danes. So we've selected not all, let me rephrase this. There's only one naturally occurring piece of citrus. All other citrus is selective breeding off of that. So we have been modifying genetics on purpose for centuries. But now when it comes with doing it directly on purpose, people are concerned about it. But there's a big sentiment around that, and then in marketing it picks up. The funniest example I saw this is I bought a water bottle one day, and the water bottle was labeled as non-GMO. And now, if you know, there's not a single piece of genetics in a piece of plastic or in water. So it is very much a cultural branding, and it actually has nothing to do with the water bottle I bought. So I think that there is a lot of just inherent bias and concern in the system. Um, and when I'm having conversations about something that's more uh, controversial, like human genetic engineering with people, I find that oftentimes what I try to help people understand is like in with HGE, it's not an if. It used to be if. Should we do this? It it is now a when. Right?
I
The
agree.
technology is here. There will be people in the world who want that. And so unless it becomes illegal, it's going to happen. So we can still have the same debates of if it should, is it right, is it moral, is it ethical? That's a whole ball of wax that people can continue to talk about while the technology passes them by and becomes reality. So we're now in an era where the question is, what does that mean? how do we grapple with this? Um, and so the sci-fi book novel that I just published is called Synthetic Eden, and it's exactly for that topic. Um, what I wanted to do is take away all of the corners that people can hide in these debates and really focus on driving one key decision for a reader. And so basically the premise of the book sets up the crux where the reader has to decide, do I support human genetic engineering or the extinction of humanity? And that's a pretty stark contrast. So like humans should die out or they should engineer themselves. And then that forces like, all right, well, there are scenarios where I'm comfortable with that because I haven't met anyone yet who said, yeah, we'll just disappear. That's better. But I don't, these conversations are also very personal. And a lot of the worldviews here are what differ, not necessarily the science. And you can't argue emotions with science. And so I think that the conversation should really be about where do people stand on kind of the would they or not? Do they care if someone else does or not? Um, the most interesting debate in this process that I find is where is the line of yes and no? So is it okay to fix an inherited genetic disease, but not give someone extra strength? Like that's also very fascinating ethical debate because why is it ethical to cure disease but not to enhance health? Who knows? Um, I don't have any answers to that, but it's fascinating, and I think my big thing is like there is no if. The technology is here. There are companies founded. Recently the first company to have a specific mission to do this was founded and announced. So the
Are
cat's
you
out of the
talking
bag.
about the Manhattan Project
Yeah,
company? Yeah,
yeah, Manhattan Genomics.
I see. Something that I've also been questioning personally is thinking about this from a transhumanist perspective. You talked about the decision of gene editing humans versus basically extinguishing humans. And I've been thinking, as we also increase our reliance on these technologies, whether you call it gene editing or even automate, because in the end, these are also going to converge, of course, with robotics and AI and so on. As we
Yeah.
increase our reliance on these technologies, could that also lead in some ways to some risks of, now it's only going to be AIs and robots that reproduce or have the ability to massively produce humans, if that's even something we can say, and
Yeah.
to choose our genetics, basically our genetic destiny.
Right.
How do you think about that dependence on AI, particularly on AI and robotics for this matter?
I think it's a fascinating time to be alive because I carry around on my phone an image of an anti-electricity ad from the early 1900s. People who were saying electricity is going to harm humanity because it'll reduce our independence and we'll be dependent on a
Mm,
technology. So we've been having these conversations for a long time. So I'm
sure.
not saying one way or another where I stand on this. I just find it fascinating that this is not a new topic. The Industrial Revolution happened, and people said the same thing about um, jobs that were much more kind of labor intensive. And I think that I find myself reflecting very philosophically a lot on these topics of like what does it mean to be human? Like what is the value add? Like how do we define the utility of humanity? And that might be this is very philosophical, but that might be also a silly question. But to the topics that the technology areas that you were just talking about, talked, I've been, I've processed them into a concept that I call fabric technologies. So fusion, nuclear fusion, AI, biotech, robotics, and what I call innovative computing. So quantum computing, neuromorphic, other forms of computing. Because if you think about it, all of a sudden, if nuclear fusion happens, we have energy abundance. because we've produced more energy than we took to make it. AI, right? Which we all know AI is starting to do thinking at a human level outside of a human. Biotech, to say, like we could literally rewrite genetics, like the foundation of what an organism is based on. Robotics all of a sudden starts to take the physical utility of humans and say we can now do a lot of embodied work that we could never do before. And then quantum means if we get true quantum computers, you never have to wait for computing again. So you have instant energy abundance, instant thinking, and then physical embodiment of all these things. So then the question is, okay, what does it mean to be human in all of that? Um, and another part is on the spectrum of like if we start genetically engineering ourselves, how where did I thought about this when I was at Colossal, the mammoth company, and I always thought about this question of where does an elephant end and a mammoth start? After what point do you genetically engineer an elephant enough that it is now officially decided as to be a mammoth? And we actually don't have good definitions of what species are. Like we basically they're like peaks and troughs in the density of how often a genetic makeup stands out. But like how far engineering along that process do you stop being human? Like I don't know. And I think a lot of these augmentations are interesting as well because so many people wear glasses, carry smartphones. Like we are augmented individuals. Like there's not a
Right.
single part of my day that doesn't have some amount of technology support in it.
Yeah, right. Humans today cannot, like our abilities, our intellectual abilities, especially, and even physical ones to move around, whatever, cannot be compared to humans, I don't know, maybe even 500 years ago,
Yeah.
or
I mean, even if
200
you
or
think about it,
100. Yeah.
the um, the Industrial Revolution and the car really came about in the early 1900s, 1910-ish. 50 years later, we landed on the moon. Like that was recent, and that was 70 years ago, or 60 years ago, something like that. So in the span of 125 years, we went from not having cars to planning travel to Mars. Um, it's just wild how fast these things move, and it's only getting faster.
It seems that also part of the argument for accelerating biology and biotechnology is other people are gonna do it anyway, since the technology exists. And these days, it's evident that the U.S. is paying increasing attention to what is happening in China. So, what yeah, well, it seems that it's only been in the recent administration. So since you have been or were working for the Pentagon previously, what did they seem to delay so much to sort of take action on on these matters? And because it's not like it happened overnight.
Yeah, I think that. So also to clarify, there has been a focus in biotech with the
Mhm.
government for a while. It has become a very public focus in the last 5-ish years, 5 to 10 years. But um, you know, the U.S. government in particular has been funding biotech research for a long time. Um, I think that I think there is. I think the United States often expects to be the leader in science, just kind of almost takes it for granted. Like we have great
Yeah.
great minds. People want to come here, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I guess we can't take it for granted anymore. Like there are other people in other countries like doing amazing things out there, and so that's where the focus to kick things into gear have really been emphasized. But I think that the big challenge, or what actually one of the so challenges and opportunities is that the way that the United States system works is that we have a lot of this just innovation percolating everywhere. And then every so often, an idea will spike up and become something really impactful. And that's a very different model than more of a top down approach of this is a key priority. This is what we're going to march towards. Because sometimes sometimes it works really well because you can execute really clearly, and other times it works well because if you didn't get it right from the top, then you end up going down a rabbit hole that you wouldn't otherwise find valuable. So I think there's pros and cons to both systems. Like I had a good conversation with some colleagues from Singapore recently, and Singapore has a very top-down approach, and they're really focused on food security for their nation. And so they're putting a lot of effort into, empowering food security for the country. That's great because they have to, right? They don't produce much of their food um, on their own ground, and so they need to have that kind of focus. Versus a country like the United States is so large and diverse that we can allow much more of this kind of spontaneous innovation to happen across the board. But not everyone sees that way, and so it's a so I mean so many of these conversations we're talking about right now are worldview conversation. Like, do you believe innovation happens spontaneously, or can you decide where you're going and get there? Genetic engineering, right? It's not if but when, but is it right now? That's a worldview conversation.
Yeah. Um, Moving forward and in these times, which would you say would maybe better ways to assess the state of biotechnology in a country like the US? Is it because it seems that it's no longer number of papers or patents. What other metrics can we use? Is it the size of biotech markets, or how much is being produced with biotech? Like, how can you assess progress in biotechnology? What metrics would you use?
I think that papers, patents, size of markets, all of those are ways to measure what I consider the most impactful is actually producing things. So I think that we need all of those steps along the way, but the science alone is interesting for knowledge, but if we don't actually operationalize it into companies and products, then we won't benefit from it. And so that then we'll be all out of really informed people with food that isn't healthy anymore or something like that. So to me, the metric that I care most about, and again, this is a worldview thing. You ask a professor and they'll say something different. If you ask a government person, they might say something different. But to me, the thing that I care most about is companies that last. And I actually have an interesting reflection that I've pondered for a while about the industry. Like the biotech industry right now is struggling, going through kind of its cycle, ebbs and flows of now there's funding the challenging right now, but I think that it will come back because I see a big shift towards a more product centric effort. But when I was first coming into this industry back in 2019, when I was um, at the DoD, a lot of biotech companies at the time would come to me and say, I can build you anything you want. Just tell me what you want. And that's like saying, I have a chemical factory. I can make any chemical do you want? What do you want? Like, I want to buy a water bottle. I don't want to buy 500 gallons of chemicals. Um, and so I started coming up with this analogy that, you know, five plus years ago, the biotech industry, the synbio industry felt very much like a really fancy potluck where everyone had brought beautiful china to serve, but no one had remembered to bring any food. So we had these beautiful platforms, but we're all starving. When in reality, the startup world is really pizza on paper plates, right? That's what I want to go for. And then eventually, okay, we mature out of the garage and now we have a real office. And like that's the traditional startup way. But I think that we flipped. We have, because a lot of we're in the phase of the industry where a lot of this technology moves out of academia, where people invent platforms and then go build a platform company, which investors love. And that's why it went that way. But really, building a product that you can expand into a platform is the pizza on paper plates, slowly evolving out of the garage. And eventually, you have a potluck where everyone has fancy china and delicious, fancy food. Um, but if you don't start with anything to eat, you'll starve before you get there. And that's kind of my metaphor I've had for the biotech industry for a while. And we're starting to see more and more product-focused biotech companies, which I think is the way to go because people can buy products. Otherwise, you're trying to sell services in a market that wants products, and so it's a little hard. And so that's why we've seen companies that have gone bankrupt and been acquired, all those kinds of things. But I'm optimistic because I'm seeing a lot more of these product-centric companies and founders who are much more focused on solving a problem by any means necessary rather than figuring out what you can sell with the only thing you have, if that makes sense.
Hmm. It seems that perhaps the platform companies believed that they would be serving entrepreneurs who would be creating these products, but then the entrepreneurs weren't enough. So, is it maybe that we have reached a tipping point in the cost of these tools that is now allowing for people even outside of academia and outside of biotech circles to build with biology and build these pizza on napkins products, or basically what is different these days, and what has led to this change from platforms to products? Is it simply failed model, let's move on to products?
I think it's a I don't think it's just a failed model. I think, and we have to give immense credit to the people who were building those platforms at first because they were the visionaries that helped build an industry, start an industry, and we wouldn't be where we are without
Right.
that. But as the industry evolves, I think we're starting to have people who've learned lessons learned from first venture now say, okay, I know it's almost like a whole era of learning. This industry is trying to figure out, all right, what are we? Who are we? And now they're like, all right, I know I had 5 customers who kept coming to me saying, if you had this, I'll buy it. And so instead of starting another platform company, they start to build that. And they've already had a little bit of market validation in that these customers they've talked to. So it's kind of a really expensive way to do customer validation that traditional startups, if that's a term, traditional startups, but the startups often usually look for. So I think it's an invaluable learning for the whole industry. I think unfortunately it's painful for a period when those companies, those first movers, those innovators didn't succeed, but I think a lot of them are building their second and third company now. And I think what will really do a lot for us is when we have that big win, right? The Apples and Microsofts of the world spawned the computer industry. Um, we just started with the chip fab rather than the laptop in the biotech industry, and we really need to start with, or the desktop, right? Computer started as mainframes. My whole office would have been one computer, rather than just selling microchips. Um, and the first era of biotech, we're selling the microchips for computers that didn't exist yet. And now the next era of biotechs are selling big clunky computers. So then our third era will start selling sleek MacBooks.
Yeah, and continuing with that analogy actually to the computer world, would you say there are any similarities in how AI companies are being built these days, or yeah, again, are we too far away from that, or can we learn anything from the ways that people are figuring out, well, what is useful to make with platform like OpenAI's, and what is not useful? Because it seems like that in the AI world is also like trying to figure out what products will actually stand the test of time.
Yeah. And I think that the beauty of software is you can live and die faster than in biology, right? The cycle is a lot faster. But if you think about the AI world, there are 3, 4, 5 main platforms: OpenAI, Claude, Anthropic, Google, Gemini, and then you have the clouds. But those are the
Yeah.
kind of the 3 big platforms. And then people are building products off of those.
Hmm.
And so the what didn't happen in SynBio at first is those product companies showing up so fast because biology is hard, right? It's a real science, it's a real technology, and you can't just you can't use your own product to write your own product, which is also kind of meta, where you
True.
use ChatGPT to write the code to
Yeah.
build on top of ChatGPT. So there's some benefits there from timing, but I do think we can take lessons learned of the AI industry. Had a couple big platform players, and then the rest, for lack of a better term, are apps, right? Just like there's only one or two cell phone makers, but most of the industry is based on the apps on cell phones. And I think that was a lot of the vision of the early platform biotech companies, but the only reason that the iPhone ended up successful is because people knew how to use phones. And then it was an innovation on phones, but they didn't have to teach them how to start using a rotary dial phone in that era.
Yeah. Yeah, Apple actually came, they weren't first movers. They came to innovate in something that already existed and making it user friendly, which seems like, biology is still somewhat far away from having its own Apple. So
So we're like in the era of the IBM mainframe for
yeah,
biology.
I see. Um, After working at all these different areas of biotech and AI, what is your internal compass or the way that you decide what is worth working on at a given time?
Oh man, that's the $1 million question. So I'm the kind of person that I am less focused on the what as the who. I love doing hard things with great people. That's how I describe my entire goal in life. Do hard things with great people. And so I actually look a lot about who I can build with, because also early stage startups, you have to pivot, pivot, pivot. So my compass is the people first. If I enjoy working with the people, if I am inspired by the people, it very much allows me to be excited about that. After that, when I'm thinking about technologies, I very much, so I'm an AI person by background. My PhD was actually doing some of the earliest generative AI in biology over a decade ago, back when we didn't call it generative AI. My dissertation actually focused on what I called latent biology, which is now basically just embeddings. Everything's an embedding in AI. But I made up a term called latent biology back then,
I like that.
because no one knew what embedding was. But so that's where I spend my personal time. And I know that everyone's on the AI hype cycle, but I've actually been working on it for well over a decade now. So I like the idea that, can we shorten cycle times to engineer biology? So this could be faster feedback loops in experiments, technologies that read and write DNA faster. Because I'm the kind of person who's interested in too many things to say I want to solve food something. So I think everyone's just got to find that one passion. But I don't have a good answer of like, here's the next
No, no, no,
sub
sure.
industry that's going to be successful. Like,
I
hopefully
know,
all
but
of them.
just personally, yeah,
Yeah.
love that. Well, then, thank you very much for your time and for sharing all these stories and interesting things with us, Titus.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Sure. And I'll share your book in the comments as well. Thank you for listening to Biofounders. Check out the links in the description, share with friends, rate it with 5 stars, and release your creative biotech powers.